My co-author, David Schwartz, of the University of Wisconsin, is on Zoom. We are both extremely glad to be here and grateful to the conference organizers for the invitation. It really is an honor to be here speaking to this group, and to Randy for agreeing very kindly to comment on our paper. Our project challenges the conventional wisdom that the original public meaning of the Constitution establishes a federal government of limited, enumerated powers, a doctrine that we call enumerationism following David's earlier work. The most vocal and enthusiastic champions of enumerationism are originalists, of course, but even critics of originalism generally accept enumerationism. The few who do reject it largely do so on structural or functionalist grounds, leaving originalist arguments for the doctrine almost entirely unchallenged on their own terms. In recent years, a growing historical literature has questioned enumerationism with signal contributions from several people in this room: Richard Primus, John Mikhail, Jonathan Gannap, among others. David has also contributed to this literature in his other work. But this historical literature has focused largely on the views, intentions, and political projects of particular individuals and groups. It has not frontally engaged originalist arguments for enumerationism on their own terms. That is, in terms of original public meaning. That is what we try to do in this paper. More specifically, we try to bring the recent historical literature into conversation with the theoretical literature on original public meaning originalism. Doing so, we think, shows that the originalist arguments for enumerationism rest on far shakier ground than is generally believed. It also highlights the difficulties for originalist theory and practice posed by contextual enrichment arguments when the context in question was unsettled, disputed, and rife with strategic behavior. We begin by showing, or trying to show, that the original semantic meaning of enumerated powers was fundamentally indeterminate. The constitutional text nowhere says that the federal government is limited to its enumerated powers, although it would have been trivially easy to do so. All of the standard textualist arguments for enumerationism, expressio unius, the words herein granted in the vesting clause, the word proper in the necessary and proper clause in the 10th Amendment, all require that the reader presuppose or assume the truth of enumerationism. Read without the presupposition of enumerationism, the original semantic meaning of the text is perfectly consistent with a rejection of that doctrine. Indeed, we think several provisions of that text, the general welfare clause, the necessary and proper clause, and the preamble, could plausibly be read, or perhaps most naturally read, at least as a purely semantic matter, to support a congressional power to address all national problems. We next show that the historical context of the founding era is similarly ambiguous, or at least that there are strong and unanswered arguments to this effect. Many readers certainly understood the Constitution to presuppose some form of enumerationism, but many did not. To make matters more complicated, the public statements of both sides of this controversy were offered in the heat of pitched political battle and cannot be taken at face value. The most plausible contextual enrichment arguments for enumerationism all depend on the existence of widely shared background assumptions that would have made the Constitution's enumerationism literally go without saying. In theory, this is entirely possible, but in fact, the Federalists who advocated an enumerationist reading during the ratification debates, whose statements represent the principal evidence supporting arguments, contextual enrichment arguments for enumerationism, were not citing such background gospel. They were offering detailed explanations and novel theories to persuade the public to embrace new assumptions. Their apparent need to do so calls into question the existence of such purportedly widespread and pre-existing assumptions. So too does the prevailing anti-federalist strategy of reading the Constitution in non-enumerationist terms. If the enumerationist character of the Constitution really went without saying, such arguments would presumably have struck the vast majority of readers and listeners as borderline ridiculous. The leading anti-federalists were extremely sophisticated operators. It seems quite unlikely that they would stake their case on such a strategy that were so obviously doomed by firm and widespread enumerationist assumptions. In this regard, many, and perhaps most of the statements about limited and enumerated powers in the ratification debates suggest a belief that the meaning of enumeration was indeterminate and was fundamentally up for grabs. If this is correct, enumerationism falls into the construction zone, where history, judicial precedent, and other sources fill the gaps in original public meaning. It is history and precedent, we think, not original meaning, that actually supply the strongest arguments for enumerationism, because enumerationism does unquestionably have deep roots in both history and practice. Yet the history of enumerationism is complex and it is fraught with contestation. For most of that history, Congress has routinely legislated as if it possessed the power to address all national problems. The Supreme Court has generally followed suit, embracing enumerationism in theory while circumventing it in practice. A rigorous enumerationism has held sway on the Supreme Court for just over 50 years of the 230 years of American constitutional history, the Tawney Court era and the Progressive and New Deal eras. To uphold congressional legislation, the court has employed a variety of interpretive expedients, including broad construction of the enumerated powers, liberal interpretation of implied powers, recognition of inherent sovereign powers, and repurposing of the Commerce Clause as a de facto general welfare clause. Many of these developments were cloaked in or accompanied by enumerationist rhetoric, but that rhetoric has been more ceremonial than substantive. The dominant reality of American constitutional practice has been broadly and for long stretches flagrantly inconsistent with enumerationism. A constitutional construction that followed this traditional approach would pose no substantial obstacle to any important federal legislation. In addition to its implications for the constitutional law of federalism, our project also, we think, has significant implications for both the theory and the practice of original public meaning originalism. At the theoretical level, the extensive founding-era disagreement and dissimulation surrounding enumeration highlights the importance and we think the difficulty of articulating a standard for establishing a determinate original public meaning. It is a foundational premise of original public meaning originalism, of course, that the linguistic meaning of a text can be vague, ambiguous, or otherwise indeterminate. But the literature is largely silent on what that standard or threshold of determinacy ought to be, what standard or threshold of determinacy the constitutional text must satisfy to be binding on contemporary interpreters and to avoid relegation to the construction zone. For any originalist argument that rests on contextual enrichment, and in particular on widely shared or ostensibly widely shared background assumptions, answering this question is crucial. We think a recent paper by Larry Solum offers the best and the most rigorous answer to date, but it is an answer that poses very serious challenges to the originalist argument for enumerationism, and we think to applied originalism more generally. According to Solum, a determinate original public meaning, quote, requires broad agreement, not unanimity or near unanimity. He allows that there will be borderline cases, but suggests, quote, that something like 90% agreement is enough. By contrast, a constitutional provision that was read one way by 60% of the population and in another substantially different way by the remaining 40% of citizens creates what we can call an irreducible ambiguity. To satisfy Solum's standard of determinacy, or any other standard in the same ballpark, originalist enumerationists would need to develop some reasonably reliable method of counting the adherents of various views, but they must also take care that the views they are counting actually support the existence of a determinate original public meaning, rather than expressing a preference or a hope or an expectation while implicitly confirming the text's ambiguity. This is difficult even in theory and far more difficult in practice, and we do not believe that any of the existing enumerationist work has overcome these very substantial difficulties. Very briefly, before I conclude, let me quickly emphasize two caveats which underscore the limits of our argument. First, our analysis is limited to original public meaning, originalism. We recognize, of course, that this is not the only significant school of contemporary originalist thought, but our focus in this paper is limited to original public meaning. Second, our goal in the paper is not to decisively refute the enumerationist conventional wisdom. It is to demonstrate that the issue is significantly closer, more complicated, and less firmly settled than is generally recognized. We are eager to hear Randy's thoughts on the paper and all of yours. Thank you very much.